In this video, I'm going to go through my current understanding of how Kikowani triggers and load zones work in the context of completing the Kikowani speedrun. So at the moment, we go out of bounds and use the Banshee to hit various triggers and load zones, and not all of them are mandatory. And hopefully we can go over some of the reasons why and which ones are the mandatory ones and exactly how the level works. So what we've got at the moment here is the scripts for Kikowani. And we're also going to be looking at the mod tool Sapien to get a better idea of visually where these triggers are and how they work. So first of all, looking at the script here, basically the entry point for the script. There's a bit of setup that's done here. And then this is the main part we want to look at. So the insertion index, I think it sort of relates to the rally points. And basically all we're concerned about is entering at that mission start at the very first insertion point. There are ways to sort of skip ahead based off different insertion index, but we're starting at the start of the mission. So we're going to be following through this small section of code here. And basically what it says is right at the start, sleep until this index is greater than or equal to 1, which I believe would be the minimum value. If that's the case, then we're going to start this set of scripts here. So this links to another function, which runs a whole bunch of scripts that relate to the mission, such as enemy spawns and the scripted sequence of Mickey hijacking the Phantom and so on and so forth. However, this whole section can get skipped over if we're able to trigger this condition right here. And what this is saying that once the player enters the trigger volume, encounter basin 1B, I think, is that what that abbreviation's for? So once we enter this trigger volume, we're able to effectively skip any conditions that are in here. And what you might imagine is that, you're in bounds and this trigger volume is hidden behind a door. And to unlock that door, you need to complete the sequence that's set up via this function. However, where we go out of bounds, go behind the door and hit the trigger and progress to the next big chunk of the mission without having to complete any of the conditions that are specified in this function. And we're actually able to do that 3 times. So we're able to skip the conditions here by hitting this trigger, and then we're able to skip the conditions here by hitting this trigger, and then we're able to skip the conditions here by hitting this trigger. So there's kind of 4 sections to this mission, and we're able to sort of leapfrog through by hitting these trigger volume, utilizing the out of bounds tricks. And then we finally wake this function here, which is shown on the right here. And we'll go back to this function a little bit later as it's slightly more complicated, but we're going to first look at the trigger volumes 1B, 2A, and 2B, and the load zones that are required to access these trigger volumes. So even though these trigger volumes may exist in space, we'll see what this sort of means. If the area isn't loaded, then the player can't actually enter the trigger volume. The map actually has to be loaded, and that's done by separate triggers. So we're hitting the mandatory trigger volumes here that are required to progress the mission, as well as the load zones that enable us to enter the space where the trigger volumes are. So we'll jump over to Sapien and have a quick look at what that actually looks like. So to start off, we're having a look at the start of the level. So over there is where the player spawns, and they come down this way and Mickey hijacks the Phantom over here. So this is the first sort of interior area. And in the speedrun, we currently sort of first Phantom out of bounds out this way, or you can sort of exit over in the wall there and fly around to here. And we end up hitting a trigger that's on the other side of this wall, and we'll take a closer look at that now. So that is trigger volume, encounter basin 1B. So that trigger volume is actually inside this building. So So if we go inside the building, we can see it here highlighted in green. So I'm going to try and make it look more obvious. So currently we're inside the middle of the box, and the green is the sides of the trigger volume. And we're currently outside the trigger volume now, and we're looking back towards it. So you can see here the idea being that you hit all the required conditions to open this door. Door opens, player goes through the door, hits this trigger, basically as soon as they enter. The interesting thing about this trigger and a couple others is that it actually clips through the side of the building here. So we're able to come around this way with our Banshee, park on a ledge just here, and hit the trigger just by standing up against the wall. Interestingly, it actually doesn't show on the other side. It actually doesn't clip through the geometry on the other side. However, if you exit with your Banshee facing forwards and sort of brush up the back of the Banshee against this wall and exit such that your hitbox actually sort of half clips through the wall, you can end up hitting this trigger through the wall. So even though the hitbox doesn't extend through the wall, you can sort of use the Banshee exit animation to sort of half clip through the wall and hit the trigger. And I have some sort of reference footage sort of shown at the end for some of these little routes and quirks and ways to hit some of these triggers. So we're able to go out of bounds, sort of snake our way through the building, come down through here, and hit the first mandatory trigger. So that trigger there, just to confirm again, is this trigger highlighted here. So we're able to skip anything that's required as part of this function call here. So now we need to see how do we make our way to the next trigger volume. Taking a look again at Sapien, we first want to take note of a load zone. So currently at the moment, you'll notice that the next part of the map isn't actually loaded. So to load that in, we need to hit a load zone, which is a separate trigger. And if we take a look at our lists here, zone sets, looking at this one here. So looking at the small little trigger highlighted in green. And that one sort of sits inside and outside the building. So you can see we're inside the trigger volume here. So that's the sort of maybe the front face or the back face of the trigger volume. And it sort of extends out into the player space over here. And we'll notice that it actually goes just to the right side, right near where we hit the trigger on the side of the wall. So we park our Banshee just down here and hit the trigger on that wall. And we need to make sure that when we're heading to the next big door over that way, you actually veer right to make sure you hit this load zone trigger. So hitting this trigger will make sure that the next part of the map loads in. Interestingly, there's an additional trigger inside here, which performs a load. And what this one does is it actually loads the next two areas together. So that one over there spawns in this next area. If you hit this one, however, it loads in the next area and the final area as well. Unfortunately, it's a little bit slower to get to, so it's potentially not useful in the speedrun, and hitting both that trigger and this trigger here, which we'll look at in a sec, to spawn the next two areas is more convenient in the current route. Potentially, this might have some use. And again, I'll show at the end of the video what it might look like if you hit this load zone as opposed to hitting that one and that one together. So now we've hit the trigger to sort of skip a quarter of the level. We've hit the load zone to load in the next part of the map. And now we're going to look at the next trigger volume. So what I've done just then is just load in the next part of the map. And this is what you'll notice in game is when hitting that trigger volume, next part of the map will load. All right, so now we've looking at the next set of triggers, and this is our next big trigger that allows us to skip a lot of the level. And we selected it, looking for a green trigger. Don't quite see it anywhere, but if we go inside, we can see it in here. So this one sits inside, just inside this doorway. And try and get some reference as to where on the ground it actually starts. So you can see this sort of square shaped mark on the ground sort of starts just towards the end of it. And this one, unlike many of the others, it doesn't actually clip through any of the walls, so you can't really see it from the outside. You actually have to go inside the building to hit this trigger volume. Sorry if that wasn't quite clear. Let's get a better angle. So you'd go inbounds through that door and go inside and then hit the trigger. It does extend out the backside, but in this case, you'd have to go inbounds, hit the trigger, and then find a way to get back out of bounds, which is currently not in the route. So trigger over there and a load zone. Then the next big trigger is inside the building. We then do second found out of bounds to get out of bounds, out past the soft barriers. And then we fly our way over this section. And then we got to look to load in the next part of the map. So we go to our zone sets, set base in 2A, and in here it is, sorry, set base in 2B is the next load zone. So we'll take a closer look at this one. So you can come in from the right side of this peak and you'll quite comfortably hit it, making sure not to be much higher than the peak of this building. However, you can sneak in on this right-hand side and just brush up against the side, and you will hit this load zone to load in the next part of the area. So just taking a look, that's sort of what it looks like. And then once you hit this trigger, you'll load in the next part of the map. All right, so that's that load zone again. So we've just brushed up against the side of the building, hit the load zone, and now we're into last section of the map. And our first goal is to hit our next big trigger. So if we look at basin 2B, we can just see it actually poking through the wall. So again, this is the next big trigger. Go inside the building and we can see same box trigger. We're currently inside the box looking at the green faces, which just means it's selected. So again, idea would be that you go through the doorway and you would end up hitting this trigger. However, it extends on the outside of this building. So we're able to brush our Banshee up against the nose of the wall and hit the trigger. And what that trigger is, again, just looking at the code, is this trigger here. So now we've sort of skipped 3/4 of the mission. However, to load the sort of end condition of the level, we need to follow through this function here. So if we take a look on the right-hand side here, we enter in through this function, and we're looking basically for these sleep untils and volume tests. So we're looking at trigger volume 2B01. Once you've hit that, some things load, some things happen, and then there's another check for 02. Same again until 03, same again until 04, same again until 05, same again until 06. And then we notice here that a bunch of recharges spawn. And what these are the squid houses that we need to shoot to end the level. So we need to hit at least up to TV trigger volume 2B06. There are more, but minimum is just to get to 0.6. An interesting thing to note is that I believe we have to hit these in order. However, that's not too much of a concern for us based off where they're positioned, and we'll take a look at where they're positioned in a moment. So here we go. Here are trigger volumes here, 2B, 0, 1 to 6. And if we take a look from aerial perspective, there's this one here, which is again inside the building, and it's just clipping through. So we brush our nose of the Banshee up against the wall, and we can hit this one from the outside. And then finally, we're going to talk about these big strips of trigger volumes that are crossing the whole map, wondering what they could be for. And we're going to have a look now. 0.2 is in fact this first one here. 0.3 is this next one. 0.4 is the next one. 0.5, 0.6. So what that means is as you fly across the open wide expanse, you end up hitting these triggers in order. They're pretty hard to miss, especially if you're inbound. And we get about halfway across, and then the recharge stations will spawn inside the building. We end up flying through the rest of these triggers in solo. That they're not really that relevant, nor is it in co-op. It just by happenstance, and we open the door and shoot the squid houses. So what this might be relevant for in particular is in co-op. There's a second player that goes around the outside and is ready to shoot the squid houses, but before they spawn and before they can shoot them, someone needs to go through and fly through these triggers. So then the triggers on the sides of the building need to be hit, as well as these ones which extend quite high up and actually extend out of bounds as well. And that's the mandatory loads and triggers in order to complete Kikowani Station, as far as I'm aware. There might be some details that I'm missing, but this is currently my understanding of the level and can show off a bit of the trigger volumes and their locations. So in summary, these are the trigger volumes we use to skip big chunks on the level. This is the first one we hit by getting out of the Banshee, and then we hit a load that's right next to it, fly across the gap to the big door, go through the big door, and just inside the big door, we walk inside and we hit this trigger. There's a load zone just further on from this trigger that ends up spawning the next two sections together, but we hit two separate individual load zones to spawn the next two sections. Once we hit this, we do second phantom out of bounds, fly across the gap out of bounds, hit this trigger first to wake this set of the scripts. On this right hand side, we can see it now. Then we hit this trigger volume again by brushing up against the side of the building. So brush up against the side of the building once, fly on the other side, brush up against the side of the building while in the Banshee. And then we hit the big slice, section slice, trigger volumes in order, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, until the recharge stations load, and then we find the shortest path to be able to get line of sight on the recharge stations to be able to end the level. Playing now just a few clips showing a bit of experimenting with the load zone triggers.
Okay, I'll grab a Banshee. You go get Dutch and Romeo. On my way! Let it burn! Head into the tunnel before another one shows up. Okay, I'll grab a Banshee. You go get Dutch and Romeo. On my way! before another one shows up. Johnny, I can fly a pelican with a panther. It's been years since they even ran a simulation. Well, let's see what you remember, Trooper. Move! Go, Mickey! Up the lift! Kill the pilots! Here goes nothing! What do you see, Gunny? A whole lot of Covenant. Gathering around the crater from that slip space route. Oh, it's good. Captain, what the? Yeah, I think you're right. Cabin secure. Flight controls read green across the board. Well, purple. She's good to go. Thanks. On my way. Gunny, I can fly a pelican with a panther. It's been years since I even ran a simulation. Well, let's see what you remember, Trooper. Move! I got more where that came from! What do you see, Gunny? A whole lot of Covenant. Gathering around the crater from that slip space rupture. I wonder what they're looking for. Captain, what the? Yeah, I think you're right. Go, Mickey! Up the lift! Kill the pilots! Here goes nothing!